How does it feel to be useless, living off others? That sentence was thrown straight at me in the middle of a family dinner, right inside an American-style steakhouse, where the clinking of glasses was still echoing and forks and knives had just paused over hot plates. My mother laughed as she said it, laughing loudly enough for the entire table to hear, clearly enough that no one could pretend they hadn't. The air froze in an instant, as if someone had just muted the entire room, and I sat there, distinctly aware of my heartbeat slowing in a strange, unnatural way. Welcome to Family Ashes, where family stories don't begin with love, but with cracks people try to hide for years. If this is your first time visiting the channel, I hope you'll consider subscribing and staying, not for the shock value, but because somewhere in this story, you might see a part of yourself. And I want to ask you one question, right now. If the person who has called you a failure for years, who made you believe you were worth nothing, is also the one living off your money, would you stay silent to keep the family dinner peaceful, or would you turn everything upside down right there at the table? If you've ever been made by your own family to believe you were worthless, stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just mine, it may belong to many people who are listening. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 33 years old and I live in Mesa, Arizona, in a small apartment right next to a parking lot, where in the mornings you can clearly hear delivery trucks revving their engines early on. I work as a shift manager for a large supermarket chain, a job with no glamour and no title worth bragging about, just someone standing between aisles, employees, and endless rotating shifts. Morning shifts, night shifts, weekends, holidays, I'm there for all of them, standing 9 to 10 hours each shift, my legs used to the numbness and my back aching long before the clock runs out. My income is enough to cover rent, utilities, gas, and simple meals, not enough for dreaming, and certainly not enough to be called successful. In my family's eyes, I'm just the girl who works at a grocery store, divorced, with no big career, no success story to tell at family gatherings, a woman so ordinary she's easy to overlook, or worse, easy to turn into an example for comparison and disappointment. After the divorce, I fell into a void I didn't even dare to name. Not because I still loved my ex, but because shame clung to me every single day, as if that failure summed up my entire existence. I moved into an apartment much smaller than before, with furniture barely filling a corner of the room, and I drove an old car that had started making strange noises whenever I accelerated. I cut almost all personal spending, no new clothes, no outings, not allowing myself anything that could be considered a luxury, because at that time there was only one thought in my head: I had done something wrong, and now I had to live as simply as possible to atone for it. My mental state was more fragile than I realized. I feared people's looks, feared the question "why did you get divorced?" even feared the silences at family dinners where everyone knew but no one said anything. Then came my mother's first phone call, one evening just after I got off work, sitting in my car in the parking lot with my hands still on the steering wheel, not yet ready to go home. She cried, her voice breaking, saying the rent had gone up, saying she couldn't manage, saying that if this got out, she would lose her standing with the relatives. Before I could even gather my thoughts, that sentence was released, light as a reminder, heavy as a verdict: if I lost my home, everyone would know you were an unfilial daughter. And in that exact moment, I understood very clearly that my weakness had been seen, and from then on, it would not be spared. Helping my mother was initially framed as something temporary, just a few months until things got better, but I knew very well that promises like that rarely have an end date. 1 month passed, then 3, and eventually I stopped counting. All I knew was that for 36 consecutive months, at the beginning of every single month, I transferred between $1,800 and $1,900 to my mother for rent, along with the electricity, water, and internet bills she sent me as if they were a natural part of my life. There was one time her credit card went past due. She called me in a panic, saying that if it wasn't paid immediately, her credit score would be ruined, and I nodded again, sent more money, telling myself it would be the last time. Altogether, when I finally sat down and added it up later, the number exceeded $65,000, not a small sum for anyone, and especially not for someone living off rotating shifts, holidays, weekends, and evenings when I came home so exhausted that my legs hurt too much to stand up again for several minutes. That money didn't come from luck or excess. It came from extra shifts I took in silence, from staying late after others had gone home, from holidays I should have had off but chose to work because the pay was a little higher. No one in the family knew, no one asked, and I didn't say anything either, because at that point, money was no longer just money. It became an invisible shackle, tightening every month, keeping me exactly where I was expected to be, silent, enduring, and continuing to pay the price. My mother's name is Linda Carter. She's nearly 60 years old, and from the outside, she's the kind of person everyone finds easy to trust. In the neighborhood where she lives, and in the church she attends every Sunday, she is always spoken of as a woman who sacrificed her entire life for her family, a mother who endured hardship, worked tirelessly, and never complained. She knows how to tell the story of her life in a way that is just sympathetic enough, just noble enough, always placing herself in the role of someone who has given so much and asked for nothing in return. I used to believe in that image, believed in it so deeply that I never once suspected that behind those stories was a repeated, intricate, and persistent pattern of behavior directed solely at me. Whenever she needed money, it always began with tears. Her voice would soften, weaken, as if one more second of hesitation from me would cause her to collapse. She spoke about sleepless nights, about the fear of losing her home, about the feeling of being abandoned. While I was still trying to comfort her and figure out how to help, she would shift to blame, bringing up every small thing from the past, how she had raised me, what she had given up because of me, as if all of it were being weighed against my decision in that moment. And when I began to hesitate, when I said that I was struggling too, she planted that familiar sense of guilt in me, that if I didn't help, I would be an unfilial daughter, the one who left her own mother with nowhere to go. Strangely enough, right after that, she would turn to praise, calling me the child with the biggest heart, the only one who wasn't like my father, the only one who truly understood her, compliments just sweet enough to make me feel I still had a place, as long as I continued to do what she needed. In front of others, especially relatives and people from the church, my mother put on a different role. She laughed when talking about my job, treating it as proof of my failure, saying I was just a grocery store employee with no real career to be proud of, while skillfully weaving in stories of her own sacrifices, of how hard it had been to raise a difficult child like me. Every time I heard those words, I felt myself shrink, not because I fully believed them, but because I had grown accustomed to being placed lower, to a position where I had to compensate by giving even more. Gradually, I realized that the public criticism and the private affection were not contradictory at all. They worked together, keeping me inside that circle of control. When I believed I was useless in the eyes of the world, I clung to the only role that still made me feel useful, the daughter who quietly paid, carried the burden, and never spoke up. The birthday dinner that night was held at a fairly upscale steakhouse, the kind of place people don't come just to eat, but to be seen, to signal that their family is still doing well, still has standing, still deserves respect. The table was set in the central area, surrounded by lively chatter, the smell of grilled meat filling the air, wine glasses being lifted and set down again and again like a familiar ritual. There were relatives from near and far, a few of my mother's old friends, and even people from the church community she was always careful to impress. I sat there, in the exact seat my mother had chosen for me, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to disappear, as if my presence only needed to exist when she wanted to make use of it. Deep down, I knew exactly why she loved spaces like this. In crowded places like these, she needed her story to stay intact, and she needed someone to contrast against it, someone to highlight her role as the mother who had sacrificed so much. Throughout the meal, I listened as she talked about her life with pride, emphasizing the hardships she had overcome, the things she had endured, occasionally letting out a light laugh as if it were all nothing, her eyes flicking toward me to make sure I was listening. And then, at the precise moment when the atmosphere felt most relaxed, when everyone had loosened up and the laughter grew louder, she chose that moment to speak the sentence that turned me into the center of attention. It wasn't a private reprimand, but a remark sharp and belittling enough to make people around us look over, enough for them to understand that in her story, I was always the part that never quite measured up. I felt the exact moment when the gazes began to converge on me, some curious, some uncomfortable, some unsure how to react. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, my breathing grew shallow, and in those brief seconds, I understood what everyone was waiting for. They expected the familiar response. I would smile it off, I would apologize, I would say something to shrink myself, just to let the dinner continue smoothly. I had always done exactly that before, a reflex conditioned over years, because I believed my silence was the price of keeping the family at peace. But that night, sitting in a room full of light and noise, something inside me shifted. I didn't lower my head to my plate. I didn't rush to apologize for making anyone uncomfortable. I didn't try to smooth things over with the usual self-blame. I sat up straight and lifted my head, letting all those eyes land on me, and for the first time, I didn't avoid the tension rising in my chest. I knew very clearly that this silence was different from all the ones before. It wasn't endurance, it was a deliberate pause, a moment of stillness before everything could erupt. And the instant I saw my mother's expression falter, just slightly, I understood that the stage she had controlled for so many years was beginning to slip from her grasp, even if no one else in the room realized it yet. I sat there for a few more seconds without saying anything, giving my heartbeat time to settle back into its proper rhythm. I realized something strange in that moment. I wasn't as afraid as I had always imagined I would be. Not because I didn't understand the consequences, but because my mind was already too clear, so clear there was no room left to turn back. I placed my hand on the tabletop, feeling the cool surface of the wood beneath my fingertips, as if to anchor myself to reality, and then I looked up. When I spoke, my voice wasn't loud, it wasn't trembling, it was even slower than usual, like someone reading out a statement that had been carefully considered long ago. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I didn't try to prove that I was right or explain how much I had been hurt, because I knew that at this table, my feelings had never been something anyone truly listened to. I simply said that starting next month, I would no longer be paying my mother's rent. I said that I had been doing it for 3 years, that I had tried within my means, and that I was stopping here. There was no apology attached, no long explanation, just a boundary set down, clear and impossible to misunderstand. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt the air in the room change, as if someone had just pulled the plug on the entire space. The knives and forks that had been moving suddenly froze, the sound of metal against plates vanished, and the silence spread so quickly that I could hear my own breathing. The father sitting across from me widened his eyes, staring as if I had just spoken something forbidden, something that had never been allowed to exist in this family, his lips parting slightly but no sound coming out. I turned to look at my mother, and that was a moment I will never forget. On her face, the polite smile she had been maintaining for everyone else got stuck in an awkward way, no longer natural, no longer smooth. For a few brief seconds, she completely lost control of her expression, her eyes flickering, the muscles in her face tightening, as if she were trying to piece her familiar role back together but couldn't do it in time. I saw a flash of confusion pass through her, followed by tightly contained anger, and finally a resolve to regain the upper hand, all unfolding in silence, right in front of the people she cared so much about impressing. At that point, the dinner table was no longer a birthday celebration. It became a stage where everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and I knew with absolute clarity that I had just taken the spotlight out of my mother's hands. No one spoke, no one dared to laugh, no one dared to break that moment, because everyone could feel that something fundamental had just shifted. And in that heavy silence, I understood that this was the true breaking point of the story, the moment when a daughter who had bowed her head for years stood upright in the middle of the room for the first time, not to rebel, but to protect herself, whatever the cost might be. I knew that a single sentence would never be enough, because in this family, my words had always been easy to twist, easy to dismiss as a moment of emotion, or worse, to label as pointless defiance. I didn't stand up right away, and I didn't rush to argue when my mother took a deep breath, preparing for the familiar role she had played so many times before. I slowly opened my handbag, my movements so calm that even I was surprised, as if I had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. I placed my phone on the table, its screen lighting up under the restaurant lights, and said that I wasn't here to accuse anyone, that I only wanted everyone to look at the truth exactly as it had happened. I opened my banking app and scrolled through the statements, line after line appearing on the screen, the numbers repeating month after month, steady and cold, rent, electricity, water, internet, all in my name. I pointed to the timeline stretching over 3 full years and stated clearly that the total amount transferred exceeded $65,000, not in a reproachful tone, but in the voice of someone reading back what she had carried in silence. I swiped to the bills I had kept, the emergency payments from when my mother's credit card had gone past due, the times I had scrambled in desperation to avoid late fees, and I left them there on the tabletop for anyone to see. Then I opened the old messages, the lines of pleading sent late at night, the words about how she would lose her home if I didn't help, how she would be looked down on by relatives, how she would be abandoned. I didn't read each message out loud, I didn't need to, because a quick glance was enough for anyone to understand how this relationship had operated. Throughout the entire process, I didn't accuse, I didn't label, I didn't say who was right or who was wrong. I simply presented the numbers and the facts and let them speak for themselves. My mother reacted exactly as I had expected. She shook her head and said that things weren't like that she had never forced me, that I had helped willingly because I was her daughter. She quickly shifted into the role of the victim, saying she was just an elderly mother pushed into a corner, saying she didn't understand why her daughter would bring money matters up in the middle of a family celebration. But this time, her words no longer echoed into the familiar emptiness. On the table, the numbers lay there quietly, not arguing, not defending themselves, simply existing as bare evidence. I looked around and noticed a change that was small but unmistakable in the eyes of those sitting there: confusion, hesitation, and for the first time, a silence that wasn't meant for my shame, but for the story my mother had been telling for so many years. In that moment, I understood that the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be placed in the right spot, and once it is there, whether it is denied or not, it remains impossible to erase. I thought everything would end there, that once the truth was laid on the table, each person would handle their own emotions in silence, the way this family has always done whenever something is too difficult to face. But then a voice rose from the head of the table, not loud, not sharp, yet it sent a different kind of shock through the room. Aunt Rachel, my mother's younger sister, who had been sitting quietly from the beginning of the meal until now, set her glass down and began to speak slowly. Her voice was low and steady, carrying neither agitation nor judgment, but sounding like someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. She said she was sorry to bring this up right now, but that she could no longer stay silent. Then she looked straight at my mother, her eyes not angry but tired, and began to recount things I had never heard anyone say out loud before. She said that many years ago, when she herself was struggling, my mother had come to her with similar stories, the same tears, the same complaints about being driven into a corner, and that she had helped, again and again. She talked about the familiar sense of guilt, about always being reminded that refusing to help would make her seem like a cold-hearted relative, about how every time she hesitated, my mother would turn to reproach and then praise, pulling her back into that cycle. I sat there listening, and each word she spoke felt like another piece being fitted into a picture I had lived inside for many years but had never seen in its entirety. Aunt Rachel said it had taken her a long time to realize she was not the only one, that what I had just laid out was not an isolated incident or an overreaction, but a pattern that had existed for a long time, the only difference being that this time it was spoken aloud in front of everyone. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer the heavy silence from before. It was a thoughtful pause, a space in which each person began to reconsider the stories they had heard, believed, and ignored. I looked around and saw expressions that had changed. Some people looked down, some sighed, some shook their heads slightly, as if they had just realized something difficult to accept. And in that moment, I felt a profound shift inside myself, because for the first time, my truth was no longer standing alone in that room. I was no longer the overly sensitive woman overreacting, no longer the incomprehensible daughter, but part of a larger story, one in which many people had been drawn into the same vortex. The presence of that witness did what I could not do on my own. It made everyone see that this was not a personal failing, but a pattern that had existed long enough to wound many people, and when the truth is no longer alone, it begins to carry a weight that no one can easily ignore. When Aunt Rachel's voice finally fell silent, I felt as if a very strange space had opened up inside my chest, not quite relief, but a rare clarity I had never experienced before. I realized that I was no longer standing in a defensive position, no longer having to struggle to prove that my feelings were real or that I had not fabricated anything. I lifted my head, looked around the dining table, and in the eyes of the people sitting there, I no longer saw the familiar judgment, but confusion, hesitation, even guilt. In that moment, I understood that if I did not state my final boundary right then, I would be pulled back into the old cycle, only this time it would be more subtle. I spoke again, still in that calm voice, but this time I was not merely informing, I was declaring. I said that I would stop all financial support, not only the rent but every other expense I had quietly shouldered for the past 3 years. I said that I had contacted the building management and was in the process of removing my name from the lease, so that from then on, I would no longer bear any legal or financial responsibility for that place. And I said very clearly, not as a threat, but to bring things to an end, that I would no longer keep secrets, that I would not continue to shield a story that had forced me to live in shame and exhaustion. Those words landed on the dining table without noise, without the kind of drama people see in films, but I could feel their weight, because I saw my mother's reaction almost immediately. She panicked, not the sudden kind of panic, but the cracking of someone who had just lost everything she was clinging to. Her eyes darted quickly around the table, searching for sympathy, searching for a familiar escape route, but this time, no one immediately stepped in to defend her. I saw the fear clearly in her eyes, not only the fear of losing her home, losing a physical place of shelter, but also the fear of losing the image of the pitiful mother she had built over many years. More importantly, I saw her realize that control was no longer in her hands. The familiar phrases, the tears that had once been effective, now seemed out of place, no longer strong enough to turn the situation around. The entire table was silent, but it was no longer the silence waiting for me to bow my head, it was the silence of power having just shifted direction. I sat there, clearly aware of this change, not with a sense of victory, but with a very strange calm, as if I had finally placed a boundary that I should have placed a long time ago. And in that moment, I understood that even if after this dinner the relationship might fracture in irreparable ways, at least from this moment on, I was no longer someone driven by fear and guilt, but someone standing on her own 2 feet, for the first time, fully. After that dinner, life did not immediately become lighter, but it became clearer. When I removed my name from the lease, when the regular payments no longer flowed each month, my mother lost the apartment she had clung to as an anchor, and along with it, the invisible layer of protection I had quietly built over the years. With no one left to carry the burden behind her, no one left to shield her, the story of the pitiful mother began to reveal gaps that no one had dared to look at directly before. As for me, I returned to my small apartment, a place without abundance, but also without anyone entering my life through guilt. I began to have savings, not much, but for the first time, I knew that money was not bound by obligation or fear. In the first nights, I slept straight through until morning, without jolting awake at the sound of my phone vibrating, without anxiously waiting for a familiar plea for help, and I realized that I had lived in that state of tension for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to truly rest. A few months later, my mother reached out on her own. This time it was not to ask for money, but to ask to meet. She said she was in therapy, that she wanted to talk, that she wanted to understand what had happened. I agreed to meet, but I did not rush to forgive, nor did I promise anything about the future. I simply held the boundaries I had already set, because I understood that healing is not about erasing the past, but about not allowing it to repeat itself in another form. And it was in that quiet space that I looked back on my entire journey and came to understand something very painful, but very real. They call you useless not because you are useless, but because when you believe you have no value, you will never dare to stop being useful to them. When you think you are a failure, you will be willing to give more, endure longer, just to hold on to a fragile place in someone else's life. That is how manipulation works, no whips, no force required, just enough guilt planted for you to bind yourself. I learned that setting boundaries is not betraying your family, nor is it selfish. Boundaries are simply a healthy distinction between what I can give and what I no longer have to carry. Some relationships can only exist when one person keeps sacrificing, and if the price of peace is that you slowly disappear from your own life, then stopping is not destroying a family, but saving yourself. Not everyone who gave birth to you has the right to consume your life, and you do not owe anyone infinite sacrifice just because of blood ties. Before ending this story, I want to leave you with a question, not for you to answer me, but for you to face yourself. If today you could cut off the chain of manipulation that has bound you for so many years, would you dare to do it? And if this story touched you, if you saw your own life somewhere in what I have shared, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and follow the Family Ashes channel. Perhaps staying and listening today will be the first step toward no longer living forever in a role that others have imposed on you.